We come now to an absolutely critical distinction, the distinction between deductive and inductive inferences. We know that an argument always exhibits some logical structure of support or justification, and in certain noteworthy cases, that support can be airtight, which means that, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be the case. That is, it is necessary. We call these conclusive inferences deductive arguments. Success for a deductive argument, then, does not come in degrees. Either the premises do in fact guarantee the conclusion, in which case the argument is a successful deduction, or they don't, in which case the attempted deduction fails.
An argument is a set of statements, called its premises, that are meant to give you a reason to believe some further statement, called the argument's conclusion. In some arguments, the premises are meant to guarantee that the conclusion is true. Arguments like this are called deductive arguments. A good deductive argument can give you a very good reason for believing its conclusion. After all, it guarantees that its conclusion is true. But not all deductive arguments are good, and so there are several things to think about when deciding whether to believe the conclusion of a deductive argument. A good deductive argument really does guarantee its conclusion. Part of what this means is that it's impossible for the premises to be true, while the conclusion is false. When this is the case, we say that the argument is valid. Now, this is a special technical use of the word valid. In ordinary life, we often use this word to mean something like good, cogent, or reasonable. Like, if you're disagreeing with someone about something, and they respond to a claim you make by saying something that seems pretty reasonable to you, you might say, well, I guess you have a valid point. Though that's what the word often means in ordinary life, it's not what the word means here. When philosophers say that an argument is valid, they always mean this very specific thing, that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. To say that an argument is valid is to say something about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, namely that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. But it's not to say that its premises or conclusion are true. Consider, for example, this argument. Premise 1. Beyoncé was born in Paris. Premise 2. Everybody who was born in Paris loves cheese. Conclusion. Therefore, Beyoncé loves cheese. Those premises are false. Beyoncé was born in Houston, and I'm willing to bet that at least some people born in Paris hate cheese. Still, it's a valid argument. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. But because the premises are false, this argument doesn't give you a good reason to believe its conclusion, even though it's valid.
In a deduction, the conclusion follows directly from the premises and nothing more needs to be added. We are absolutely certain of the conclusion. It's like working with a closed set or a puzzle that is not missing any pieces. From the pieces, you deduce that the conclusion necessarily follows. So, if the premises are true, then it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Successful deductive arguments have a feature known as validity. An argument is valid in each of the following circumstances. First, its premises guarantee its conclusion. That is, if its premises are true, then its conclusion must also be true. That is, it is impossible for its premises to be true and its conclusion to be false. Here's an example of a valid deductive argument, one which you'll recognize. Premise 1, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Conclusion, so Socrates is mortal. This argument is valid because the premises do in fact guarantee the conclusion. If they're true, as a matter of fact they are, then the conclusion must be true. It's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Here's a surprising fact about validity. What makes a deductive argument valid has nothing to do with its content. Rather, validity is entirely determined by the argument's form. That is to say, what makes our Socrates argument valid is not that it says a bunch of accurate things about Socrates' humanity and mortality. The content doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Instead, it's the form that matters, the pattern that the argument exhibits. And what is logical form? For the time being, we'll define form as what's left over when you strip away all the non-logical terms and substitute placeholders for them. Here's what our Socrates argument looks like then. Premise 1, all A or B. Premise 2, X is an A. Conclusion, so X is a B. The letters are placeholders. They represent nothing in particular. As a matter of convention, we're using capital letters to stand for categories of things, such as the category of humans or the category of mortals, and lowercase letters to stand for individual things, such as Socrates. The Socrates argument is a valid argument because it exhibits a valid form, since it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, in that it's impossible to plug in terms for A, B, and X in such a way that the premises come out true and the conclusion comes out false. It just can't be done. A consequence of the fact that validity is determined entirely by an argument's form is that, given a valid form, every single argument that has that form, or is a substitution instance of it, also will be valid. So any argument that has the same form as our Socrates argument will be valid. That is, we can pick things at random to stick in for A, B, and X, and we're guaranteed to get a valid result. Here's a silly example. Premise 1, all U.S. senators are groundhogs. Premise 2, Donald Trump is a U.S. senator. Conclusion, so Donald Trump is a groundhog. This argument has the same form as the Socrates argument. We simply replaced A with U.S. Senator, B with groundhogs, and X with Donald Trump. That means it's a valid argument even if its premises are clearly false. Nonetheless, the form is valid. Our second definition of validity can guide us here. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So, if in fact U.S. senators were groundhogs, and if Donald Trump were a U.S. senator, then the conclusion would be unavoidable. Trump would have to be a groundhog. The premises aren't true, but if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And that's what we mean by validity. Here's what's important to realize. The actual truth or falsity of the propositions in a valid argument are completely irrelevant to its validity. The Socrates argument has all true proposition and it's valid. The Donald Trump argument has all false propositions, but it's valid too. They're both valid because they have a valid form, and the truth or falsity of their component propositions doesn't make a whit of difference. This means that a valid argument can have propositions with almost any combination of truth values except for one. You'll never get true premises and a false conclusion, since those truth values are an indicator of an invalid argument. Because validity is a function of an argument's form, it's possible to generate valid arguments that are nevertheless completely preposterous. Remember, the Donald Trump argument is valid, despite the fact that we concluded that he's a groundhog. But that's ridiculous. The Trump argument has serious deficiencies. After all, it's a collection of nonsensical claims. So we need a new concept to specify what's wrong with the Trump argument. That concept is soundness. This is a higher standard of argument acceptability than validity. In order to meet it, an argument must satisfy two conditions. An argument is sound if and only if it's valid and its premises are in fact true. The Trump argument, while valid, is not sound because it fails to satisfy the second condition. Its premises are both false. The Socrates argument, however, is sound because it's valid and has premises that are all true. Logic in general can tell us whether or not an argument is valid, but it can't tell us whether or not it's sound, since the determination of the truth value of an argument's premises lies elsewhere. Propositions make claims about how things are in reality. To figure out whether claims are true or false, you need to consult either your own experience or experts in the relevant subject matter.